I thought I was on a romantic honeymoon, but when I discovered the hidden bunker under our bedroom floor, I realized I was trapped in the heart of a dangerous, organized scheme. My husband wasn't the man I married. He was a high-value target for a major internal security investigation, and I was the only witness left to his crimes. The marble floors of the villa felt cold beneath my silk slippers, a stark contrast to the stifling, humid heat of the Mediterranean summer outside. When Julian promised me a honeymoon in a remote corner of the coast, I had envisioned golden sands, crowded plazas, and the vibrant hum of local markets. Instead, he brought me to this architectural fortress, a monolith of glass and white stone, perched precariously on a jagged cliff, accessible only by a winding, treacherous road that seemed to vanish into the thick, pine-choked forest. "It's private, Elena," he had whispered, his hand firm against the small of my back as he guided me through the heavy oak doors. "Just you and me. No distractions, no world." At the time, it sounded romantic, a declaration of devotion. But as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the sprawling living room, the isolation started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The house was cavernous, filled with modern art that felt cold and clinical, and the silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. That was when she appeared. I hadn't heard the door open, nor had I heard footsteps on the polished stone. One moment the hallway was empty, and the next, a woman was standing in the shadows of the foyer. She was dressed in a stiff, charcoal-gray uniform that looked more like a vestige of a bygone era than modern staff attire. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it made her eyes look permanently startled. "This is Sophia," Julian said, his voice clipped and devoid of his usual warmth. He didn't look at her when he spoke, keeping his gaze fixed on the wine he was pouring. "She manages the house. She doesn't speak. She won't interrupt our time together, and she expects nothing from us. Treat her like the furniture, Elena. It's better that way." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Sophia hadn't even blinked. She stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze fixed on a point just above my shoulder. When I tried to offer a polite smile, her expression remained frozen, a mask of total indifference. I turned to ask Julian why he hadn't mentioned hired help, but he had already walked into the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made me jump. The next 2 days blurred into a haze of sensory deprivation. Julian was constantly busy with his laptop, sequestered in his office, and Sophia was a ghost. She moved through the house with a terrifying rhythmic precision. I would wake up to find a tray of coffee already on the nightstand, yet I never heard her enter the room. I tried to catch her eye, to thank her, to ask her a simple question about the villa's history, but she would simply bow her head and glide away. It was on the third evening that the first crack in the facade appeared. Julian had left his phone on the kitchen island while he went to the cellar to retrieve a bottle of vintage wine. The screen lit up, an incoming message from an unknown number. I hadn't intended to look, but the glow caught my eye. The message wasn't a text, but a photo. It was a picture of me, standing on the villa's balcony taken from the woods below. Beneath it, a single line of text. "The network is compromised. Move the shipment." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Shipment? What shipment? I didn't have time to process the words before I heard heavy boots thumping on the cellar stairs. I scrambled away, my breath coming in jagged gasps. As I turned to flee, I collided with Sophia. She grabbed my arm to steady me, her grip impossibly strong like iron bands. Her eyes, usually void of emotion, were wide and frantic. She pressed a finger to her lips, then reached into her pocket and shoved a small, cold key into my palm. Before I could speak, she pointed toward the floorboards under the rug in the library, then looked toward the basement door, her face pale with unmistakable terror. As Julian's voice boomed from the hall, calling my name with a tone that was no longer loving but predatory, Sophia shoved me toward the library door and vanished into the darkness. The key in my palm felt like a live coal burning through my skin. Julian's footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate, the sound of a hunter closing in on his prey. I didn't think. I moved. I scrambled into the library, the scent of old parchment and expensive leather swirling around me, and practically dove for the heavy, hand-woven rug Sophia had signaled toward. My fingers clawed at the edge, dragging it aside to reveal a circular brass handle embedded in the floorboards. "Elena, is everything all right, darling?" Julian's voice drifted from the hallway. He sounded calm, but it was the calm of a calm sea before a tsunami, deceptive and dangerous. "I've opened a special bottle. Come out here." I jammed the key into the lock. It turned with a sickeningly smooth click. Beneath the floor lay a narrow, spiraling staircase cast in shadows. As I lifted the heavy wooden panel, a draft of damp, metallic air hit my face. It didn't smell like a cellar. It smelled like an interrogation room, like secrets and cold metal. I descended, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it through the wood. I pulled the panel shut just as the library door swung open. "Elena?" His tone had shifted. The mask of the doting husband was slipping, replaced by a jagged edge of irritation. I crouched in the dark, watching through the narrow gaps in the floorboards. Julian stood in the center of the library. He wasn't holding a bottle of wine. In his hand, he held a sleek, heavy piece of illegal hardware, an item that had no place in a honeymoon villa. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp, predatory. He walked toward the rug, his boots coming to a halt directly over my head. "I know you saw it, Elena," he whispered to the empty air. "You were always too curious for your own good. It's why I fell in love with you, and it's why this is going to be so difficult." I stifled a sob, pressing my hand over my mouth until my knuckles turned white. Below me, in the dim light of the hidden corridor, I saw shapes. Stacks of crates lined the walls. I moved closer, my flashlight beam, a tiny, flickering thing, revealing the contents. They weren't just goods. There were dense, sealed packages with strange insignias, stacks of passports and files containing photos of people I recognized from the news. People who had gone missing in high-profile cases. This wasn't a villa. It was a node in a massive, dark, organized scheme. A floorboard creaked above me. Julian had moved. I turned and ran down the passage, my heart screaming in my chest. The tunnel was long, winding deep into the cliffside. As I pushed forward, I stumbled upon a small room, more like a cell, equipped with nothing but a monitor and a desk. The screen was flickering. I squinted, reading the text, scrolling across it. It was a report from a service of internal security. They were tracking this location. They knew exactly who Julian was. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a high-value target for a major investigation. Suddenly, a red light blinked on the wall, followed by the blare of an alarm that shattered the silence of the bunker. I spun around, hearing the sound of the floor panel above being ripped open. Julian was coming down, but he wasn't alone. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps behind him, other men hard-faced and cold. I looked for an exit, finding only a heavy iron door at the end of the passage. I shoved it open and stumbled out onto a narrow ledge overlooking the crashing ocean hundreds of feet below. I was trapped between the roaring sea and the men descending into the dark. I turned back, desperate to find a place to hide, but stopped cold. Standing in the tunnel behind me was Sophia. She wasn't the mute maid anymore. She held a small electronic device in one hand, her face devoid of any emotion, and in her other hand she held a weapon aimed directly at my chest. She wasn't helping me escape. She was guarding the exit, and she looked ready to pull the trigger to ensure I didn't leave the premises alive. The salt spray whipped against my face, cold and biting, but it was nothing compared to the ice in Sophia's eyes. She stood between me and the dark throat of the tunnel, her posture transformed. The bowed head and submissive gait of the mute maid were gone. In their place stood a professional, a sentinel of this nightmare. I backed away, my heels hovering over the jagged drop to the churning Atlantic. "Sophia, please!" I gasped, my voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. "You saw what he's doing. You saw the files. He's going to use you, too." She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She just gestured with a weapon, a silent command for me to retreat back into the tunnel. Julian's laughter echoed from the darkness behind her, a hollow, triumphant sound that signaled he had caught up to his hunt. He emerged into the dim light of the ledge, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the chase, the illegal hardware held steady in his grip. "You really should have stayed in the library, Elena," Julian said, stepping past Sophia as if she were a mere puppet on a string. "We could have had a lovely evening. Now you've seen the infrastructure of our little organized scheme. It's a shame. You were my favorite project." He raised the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. My breath hitched, a final prayer forming on my lips, when suddenly a piercing, high-pitched whine erupted from Sophia's hand. She had pressed a button on the device she'd been holding. Julian froze, his eyes widening as a sudden, sharp tremor shook the entire cliffside. Dust poured from the ceiling of the tunnel, and the ground beneath Julian's feet cracked. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a controlled detonation. From the woods above, a swarm of black-clad figures descended with military precision. They weren't soldiers, but agents of the Internal Security Service. I realized then that Sophia hadn't been guarding me for Julian. She had been keeping him contained, waiting for the signal to strike. The mute maid dropped her weapon and pulled a radio from her vest, speaking for the first time in a sharp, authoritative tone. "Target is neutralized. The facility is compromised. Breach the perimeter." Julian roared, spinning around to fire, but he was too late. Flashbangs detonated, turning the night into a blinding white void. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my back against the cold stone of the cliff wall. When the ringing in my ears faded, the only sounds were the waves and the metallic clatter of equipment. When I opened my eyes, Julian was pinned to the ground, his face pressed into the wet rock, his weapon discarded yards away. Sophia stood over him, her expression finally softening into something resembling human pity. She turned to me and offered a hand. "We've been tracking this group for months, Elena," she said, her voice raspy from disuse but steady. "We needed to be sure he would lead us to the main server. You were never just a bride. You were the leverage we needed to make him stop hiding." I let her pull me up, my legs trembling like jelly. As the agents hauled Julian away, his screams of denial silenced by the reality of the massive, decades-long sentences awaiting him for his role in this attempt to break his life with criminal charges, I looked back at the villa. It looked like a tomb, a house built on lies that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own darkness. I walked toward the agent's transport, the cold air finally feeling like freedom. I had gone to that villa looking for a life of luxury and love, only to find the depths of human cruelty. But as I watched the lights of the approaching rescue team flicker through the pines, I knew the nightmare was over. I had lost my husband, my innocence, and my trust in the world. But for the first time in months, I could breathe. And as I looked out at the ocean, I knew that whatever came next, I would never again be someone else's secret. I was finally, irrevocably free.